The city of Jerusalem stood in uneasy silence, its ancient stones carrying the weight of generations that had both honored and betrayed their covenant with God, long before the reign of the young king who now ruled the throne of Judah. The streets of the city had been filled with altars that were never meant to exist. Shrines dedicated to foreign gods had appeared in hidden courtyards and public squares alike. Incense burned before carved images, and the voices of priests who once served the God of Israel had grown faint beneath the louder cries of pagan rituals. The spiritual heart of the nation had slowly drifted away from the law that had once guided it, and few among the people seemed to recognize how dangerous that drift had become. Yet in the midst of this quiet decline, history was preparing an unexpected turning point. On the throne of Judah sat a young king named Josiah, a ruler whose age alone would have made him easy to underestimate. When he first inherited the crown, he was only a child, placed in a position of enormous responsibility after the violent and unstable reigns of the kings who came before him. His grandfather Manasseh had ruled for decades and left behind a legacy of widespread idolatry. Under Manasseh's leadership, altars to foreign gods had been erected even within the temple courts themselves, a shocking act that symbolized how deeply corruption had penetrated the spiritual life of Judah. His son Amon followed the same path, continuing the practices that dishonored the covenant established centuries earlier through Moses. When Josiah finally became king after his father's sudden death, the nation he inherited was spiritually fractured. The temple still stood in Jerusalem, but its significance had been overshadowed by years of neglect and competing religious practices. Priests still served within its walls, yet many of them had grown accustomed to rituals that blended the worship of the God of Israel with the traditions of surrounding nations. What had once been sacred had gradually become routine, and what had once been forbidden had slowly become tolerated. But something about Josiah was different. Even in his youth, the king began to show a quiet determination to seek the God his ancestors had once followed faithfully. While the details of his early years are not fully recorded, the ancient accounts describe a young ruler who gradually turned his attention toward restoring the spiritual identity of his nation. By the time Josiah reached his teenage years, he had already begun to reject the idols that filled the land. The process was slow at first, but it revealed a heart that was searching for something deeper than the traditions he had inherited. Years passed, and the young king matured into a leader whose decisions began reshaping the kingdom. One of the most significant actions of his reign began during the 18th year of his rule, when Josiah ordered that repairs be made to the temple in Jerusalem. The building had suffered decades of neglect. Its walls still stood strong, but the structure required restoration if it was to reclaim its place as the spiritual center of Judah. The king sent officials to oversee the work, including the high priest Hilkiah. Workers were gathered, funds were distributed, and the long process of repairing the temple began. Stones were cleaned, damaged sections were rebuilt, and the inner rooms of the sacred structure were opened once again after years of disuse. It was during this restoration that something extraordinary happened. While examining the temple chambers, Hilkiah discovered an ancient scroll that had been hidden or forgotten among the temple archives. At first glance, it may have seemed like nothing more than an old document covered in dust, but as the high priest unrolled the parchment and began to read the words written upon it, a realization slowly began to settle over him. The scroll contained the book of the law. For generations, this sacred text had defined the covenant between God and Israel. It contained the commands, warnings, and promises that had guided the nation since the days when Moses led the Israelites through the wilderness. Yet somehow, over the years of spiritual neglect and idolatry, this very document had faded from the center of Judah's life. Now it had been found again. Recognizing the importance of what he held, Hilkiah brought the scroll to the royal officials, who then carried it to the king himself. When the words of the law were finally read aloud in the presence of Josiah, the reaction of the young ruler was immediate and dramatic. The king tore his robes. In the ancient world, this act was not a sign of anger but of grief and deep distress. As Josiah listened to the commands written in the law, he realized how far the nation had strayed from the path laid out by God centuries earlier. The laws described a covenant filled with blessings for obedience but also warnings of severe consequences if the people turned toward idolatry and injustice. Listening to those words, Josiah understood something that few leaders ever fully grasp. The nation standing around him had already broken many of those commands. The king recognized that the spiritual condition of Judah placed them in serious danger. If the covenant described in the scroll was still binding and Josiah believed it was, then the consequences described within it might already be unfolding around them. But there was one question the king needed answered before he could decide what to do next. Were the warnings written in the scroll about to fall upon Judah, or was there still time for the nation to change its course? Determined to find the answer, Josiah gathered a group of trusted officials and gave them a specific command. They were to seek the guidance of a prophet, someone who could speak with authority about what God intended for the future of Judah. At that time there were several prophetic voices within the land, but the delegation chosen by the king did not travel to the most famous names of the era. Instead, they made their way through the streets of Jerusalem toward the home of a woman whose voice carried a quiet but unmistakable authority. Her name was Huldah. She lived in a part of the city known as the Second District, a neighborhood that may not have appeared remarkable to outsiders but had become known among the people of Jerusalem as the dwelling place of a prophet who spoke with clarity and conviction. Unlike the royal courts or temple chambers where priests and officials gathered, Huldah's home stood within the everyday life of the city. Yet those who came seeking her counsel did so with a sense of expectation, because Huldah was known not merely as a wise woman, but as a prophetess, someone believed to carry the authority to deliver the word of God. When the king's delegation arrived at her door, they carried with them the scroll that had been discovered in the temple. They also carried the question that had been troubling Josiah's mind since the moment he heard its words. What did this rediscovered law mean for the future of Judah? The officials explained the discovery, recounting how the book of the law had been found during the temple repairs and how the king had responded with grief and urgency after hearing its contents. Then they presented the question directly to the prophetess. They needed to know whether the warnings written in that scroll were about to come true. For a moment, the room must have felt heavy with anticipation. The fate of an entire nation seemed to hang in the balance, waiting for the words that Huldah was about to speak. And when the prophetess finally opened her mouth, the message she delivered would reshape the destiny of Judah and secure her place in history as one of the most influential yet often forgotten voices in the entire biblical narrative. The room where the delegation stood was quiet, but it was not the kind of silence that comes from peace. It was the silence of expectation, the heavy pause that falls when people know they are about to hear something that could change everything. The scroll lay open in their hands, its ancient words still echoing in their minds, and before them stood Huldah, the woman they had come to consult on behalf of the king. She was not surrounded by the grandeur of royal courts or temple ceremony. There were no priests chanting, no crowds waiting outside, no display of power or status. Yet the authority present in that moment did not depend on titles or surroundings. The officials had come because they believed that this woman carried the ability to speak the truth of God with clarity, and now they waited for that truth to be revealed. The delegation sent by Josiah explained everything carefully. They described the repairs taking place within the temple, the discovery made by Hilkiah, and the shock that had swept through the palace when the words of the ancient law were finally read aloud. They spoke about the king's reaction, how he tore his garments in grief after realizing how far the nation of Judah had strayed from the covenant established centuries earlier through Moses. The message of the scroll had not been vague. It spoke clearly about blessings that would follow obedience and devastating consequences that would follow rebellion. As the officials finished recounting the story, the question that had driven them across the city hung heavily in the air. Was Judah now standing on the edge of those consequences? For years the nation had lived as though the covenant barely existed. Altars dedicated to foreign gods had been scattered throughout the land. Sacred places had been neglected. Rituals had been altered, and the spiritual identity of the people had been slowly eroded by the influence of surrounding cultures. Now suddenly confronted with the rediscovered law, the king realized that the warnings written within it might still be waiting to unfold. The officials needed to know if the disaster described in the scroll was already approaching. Huldah listened to every word they spoke without interruption. There was no sign of hesitation in her expression, no uncertainty about the weight of the moment. Prophets throughout the history of Israel had often delivered messages that kings did not want to hear, and this situation was no different. The men standing before her represented the authority of the throne, yet the message she carried did not belong to the throne. It came from a higher authority, one that could not be softened or adjusted to suit political comfort. When Huldah finally spoke, she did not begin with speculation or careful diplomatic language. She spoke with the directness that had always defined the voice of a true prophet. She told the officials to return to the king with a message from the Lord. Her words were clear, and they carried a seriousness that must have sent a chill through those who heard them. The God of Israel had seen everything that had taken place within the nation. Nothing had been hidden. The years of idolatry, the abandoned commands, the worship of foreign gods, all of it had been witnessed. The covenant written in the scroll was not an ancient relic that had lost its authority over time. It was still alive, and the consequences described within it were still real. Judah had broken that covenant repeatedly. Because of that, Huldah declared that the judgment written in the book of the law would indeed come upon the land. The message was devastating. The disasters described in the scroll, the curses that would follow generations of rebellion, would not simply disappear. Because the book had been rediscovered, the nation had walked too far down a path of corruption for the consequences to be completely avoided. The idols that filled the land had provoked the anger of God, and the damage caused by those choices could not be erased overnight. Yet the prophecy did not end there. After delivering the warning concerning the nation as a whole, Huldah turned her attention to the king himself. The message she now spoke was different in tone, revealing something important about the character of the ruler who had sent the delegation to her door. God had seen the response of King Josiah. When the words of the law were read to him, the king did not react with arrogance or denial. He did not dismiss the warnings as exaggerated threats or ancient traditions that no longer applied. Instead, he responded with humility. His grief over the spiritual condition of Judah was genuine, and his desire to seek guidance showed that his heart was different from the rulers who came before him. Because of that humility, Huldah delivered a remarkable promise. The disasters described in the scroll would not occur during the lifetime of Josiah. The king would not witness the destruction that future generations would eventually experience. Instead, he would be gathered to his ancestors in peace before the full weight of judgment fell upon the nation. It was not a complete reversal of the prophecy, but it was a powerful assurance that the king's faithfulness had been recognized. The room fell silent again after Huldah finished speaking. The message she had delivered carried both hope and sorrow. On one hand, it confirmed that the warnings written in the book of the law were real and unavoidable. Judah had wandered too far from its covenant to escape every consequence. On the other hand, it revealed that the sincerity of Josiah's heart had made a difference. His humility had not erased the past, but it had changed the future in ways that would affect both his life and the destiny of the kingdom. The officials who had come to consult the prophetess now understood the responsibility placed upon them. They had to carry this message back to the palace and place it before the king exactly as it had been spoken. There would be no room for altering the prophecy. When the delegation returned to Jerusalem's royal court, they delivered the words of Huldah without hesitation. As Josiah listened, he was forced to confront the reality that the nation he ruled stood under the shadow of divine judgment. The rediscovery of the law had not only revealed what Judah was meant to be, had revealed how far the people had fallen from that calling. But Josiah did not respond with despair. Instead, the prophecy seemed to ignite something even stronger within him. If the nation was drifting toward destruction because of its past disobedience, then the only path forward was to restore the covenant with every ounce of determination he possessed. The king realized that he might not be able to erase the consequences of generations of rebellion, but he could still lead his people back toward the path of obedience. What followed would become one of the most dramatic spiritual reforms in the history of Judah. Temples dedicated to foreign gods would be destroyed, idols would be torn down, sacred places corrupted by pagan rituals would be purified or eliminated entirely. The rediscovered book of the law would once again become the center of the nation's identity. And at the heart of that turning point stood the quiet yet powerful voice of a woman whose prophecy had awakened a king to the seriousness of his calling. Though her name appears only briefly in the historical record, the message delivered by Huldah had set in motion a transformation that would ripple across the entire kingdom. Because sometimes the destiny of a nation changes not through armies or politics, but through a single moment when truth is spoken without fear. The words spoken by Huldah did not fade after they were delivered in her quiet home within the city of Jerusalem. When the royal delegation returned and repeated her message before Josiah, the atmosphere in the palace shifted in a way that few moments in a nation's history ever do. The young king now understood the full weight of what had been uncovered in the temple. The rediscovered scroll was not merely an ancient document or a forgotten religious text. It was the covenant that had once defined the entire identity of the nation of Judah. And according to the message, delivered through the prophetess, that covenant had been broken again and again for generations. Josiah did not attempt to dismiss the prophecy or argue against it. Many kings throughout history, when confronted with uncomfortable truth, had chosen denial over humility. They surrounded themselves with advisors who would soften harsh realities or reinterpret warnings until those warnings lost their power. But Josiah did the opposite. The moment he heard the confirmation that the words in the book of the law still carried authority, he realized that the future of his kingdom depended on how he responded now. The king ordered that the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem be gathered together. Word spread quickly through the capital. Elders, priests, officials, and representatives from across the land were summoned to the temple courts. The gathering was unlike any ordinary assembly of government or religious leaders. Something significant was about to happen, something that would determine the direction of the nation for years to come. When the people finally filled the temple courts, Josiah stood before them with the scroll that had been discovered during the repairs. Nearby stood the high priest Hilkiah, the man who had first uncovered the ancient text hidden among the temple chambers. Around them were the priests who served within the sacred building, along with the officials responsible for carrying out the king's commands. Yet beyond these leaders were the ordinary citizens of Jerusalem who had gathered to witness what their king would say. The scene must have been striking. For years, the temple had existed in the shadow of competing altars and divided loyalties. Worship practices throughout the land had blended the traditions of Israel with the customs of surrounding nations. Many people had grown accustomed to a spiritual life that was fragmented and confused. But now, standing before the assembled crowd, Josiah held in his hands the very law that once defined the covenant between the people and their God. He began to read. As the words of the ancient scroll echoed through the temple courts, listeners heard commands that many of them had never encountered before. The law spoke about devotion to one God, about justice, about compassion for the vulnerable, and about the dangers of idolatry. It described blessings promised to a nation that walked faithfully in obedience, but it also warned of disaster if the people turned away from that path. For those who had lived under the influence of the previous kings, the message must have been both shocking and illuminating. The reigns of Manasseh and Amon had normalized practices that directly contradicted the covenant written in the scroll. Idols had been welcomed into places that once belonged solely to the worship of the God of Israel. Sacred spaces had been polluted with rituals borrowed from foreign cultures. Now those contradictions were being exposed publicly. When Josiah finished reading, he did something that transformed the moment from a simple public reading into a historic turning point. Standing before the temple and the gathered leaders of Judah, the king made a covenant. He pledged that he would follow the Lord and keep the commands written in the scroll with all his heart and soul. His commitment was not vague or symbolic. It was a declaration that the law rediscovered in the temple would once again become the foundation of the nation's identity. The people who stood in the temple courts joined him in that covenant. At least in that moment, the nation turned its attention back toward the path that had once guided it centuries earlier. The prophecy spoken by Huldah had awakened something powerful within Josiah. Rather than surrendering to despair over the coming judgment, the king chose to lead a movement of renewal that would reshape the kingdom. But words alone were not enough. Josiah understood that if the covenant was to be restored, the physical landscape of Judah would also need to change. Idols could not remain standing while the people claimed to serve the God of Israel. Sacred places dedicated to foreign gods could not continue operating alongside the temple in Jerusalem. The nation had to remove the symbols of its rebellion if it truly intended to return to obedience. And so the king began one of the most sweeping religious reforms in the history of Judah. Orders were issued to remove every object connected to the worship of false gods from the temple itself. Priests who had served idols were dismissed from their positions. Altars dedicated to foreign deities were torn down, and the sacred poles associated with pagan rituals were cut apart and burned. The temple courts, which had once been polluted by years of spiritual compromise, were cleansed with determination and urgency. The reforms did not stop within the walls of Jerusalem. Josiah sent officials throughout the entire kingdom to dismantle the shrines that had been built in towns and villages across Judah. These high places had long served as centers of local worship, but many of them had become deeply connected with idolatrous practices. Under the king's command, they were destroyed one by one. The campaign extended even further than that. Josiah's influence reached into territories that had once belonged to the northern kingdom of Israel, which had fallen to foreign conquest decades earlier. In those regions, he also ordered the removal of altars dedicated to false gods, signaling his determination to restore the worship of the God of Israel wherever his authority could reach. Throughout this transformation, the prophecy delivered by Huldah remained in the background like a quiet but powerful reminder. The king knew that the coming judgment described in the book of the law would not be completely erased, yet he also understood that obedience still mattered. Faithfulness still mattered. The covenant still mattered. And so Josiah continued the work with relentless focus. The idols that had once filled the land began to disappear. Shrines that had stood for decades were dismantled. Rituals that had become routine were suddenly forbidden. The spiritual identity of the nation was being rebuilt piece by piece. All of this had begun because a forgotten scroll had been discovered during the repair of a neglected temple, and the meaning of that scroll had been confirmed by the clear and fearless words of a prophetess whose voice carried the authority of truth. The people of Judah might have overlooked her name in the years that followed. History would remember the reforms of Josiah with admiration, and the rediscovery of the law would become a defining moment in the story of the nation. But behind that transformation stood the message first spoken by Huldah, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful turning points in history begin with a single voice willing to speak the truth of God without hesitation. The reforms initiated by Josiah did not unfold quietly or gradually. Once the king committed himself to restoring the covenant described in the rediscovered book of the law, the transformation of the kingdom began with an intensity that few rulers in the history of Judah had ever attempted. The idols that had once filled the land were not simply ignored or left to decay with time. They were hunted down and removed with deliberate purpose, as though the king understood that every statue, shrine, and altar represented a lingering echo of the rebellion that had slowly corrupted the nation. The temple in Jerusalem became the first focus of this cleansing. For years it had stood as a symbol of the covenant between God and Israel. Yet the influence of earlier kings had allowed foreign practices to infiltrate its sacred courts. During the reign of Manasseh, altars to foreign gods had been placed within the very structure meant to honor the God of Israel. Images connected to the worship of pagan deities had been installed in places where generations before had offered sacrifices according to the commands given through Moses. The corruption had been so complete that many people in Jerusalem had grown accustomed to it, as though the temple's sacred identity could easily coexist with the rituals of surrounding nations. Josiah refused to allow that mixture to continue. Under his command, the priests and workers entered the temple courts and began removing everything that had been introduced during the years of idolatry. Objects associated with the worship of false gods were carried out of the sacred precincts and destroyed outside the city. The images and ceremonial instruments tied to pagan rituals were burned until nothing remained but ash. What had once polluted the temple was erased with an urgency that revealed how seriously the king now regarded the covenant. Yet the temple itself was only the beginning. Beyond the walls of Jerusalem, countless altars and shrines had been established throughout the countryside of Judah. These high places, scattered among hills and villages, had become centers of worship for people who rarely traveled to the temple. In earlier generations, some of these locations had been used to honor the God of Israel. But over time, many had become deeply entangled with the traditions of foreign religions. Josiah sent officials and priests across the land with orders that were unmistakable. Every shrine dedicated to foreign gods was to be dismantled. Altars associated with pagan rituals were to be torn down. Sacred poles erected for fertility worship were cut apart and burned. The carved images that once stood proudly before worshippers were smashed into fragments. The campaign moved steadily through towns and rural regions alike, leaving behind a landscape transformed by the determination of a king who refused to allow the spiritual confusion of previous generations to continue. Among the targets of this reform were the priests who had served those altars. Many of them had grown comfortable with practices that blended the worship of Israel's God with the rituals of neighboring cultures. Josiah's reforms stripped them of their positions and removed their authority. The king understood that if the covenant was to be restored, leadership itself had to change. Those responsible for guiding the spiritual life of the nation could no longer promote traditions that contradicted the law discovered in the temple. The influence of the reforms soon spread beyond Judah itself. Decades earlier, the northern kingdom of Israel had collapsed after conquest by a foreign empire. Many of its cities had been abandoned or repopulated by different groups of people, yet remnants of the old religious structures still remained scattered across the region. Rather than limiting his actions to the borders of Judah, Josiah extended his campaign northward into territories that had once belonged to his ancestors. There, too, he ordered the destruction of altars dedicated to false gods. Shrines that had stood since the days of the divided kingdom were dismantled. Sacred sites where generations had offered sacrifices to foreign deities were defiled and abandoned. The king's actions seemed driven by a deep conviction that the covenant restored in Jerusalem should influence every place where the memory of Israel's identity still lingered. As these changes swept across the land, the memory of the prophecies spoken by Huldah remained quietly present in the background. Her words had made it clear that the consequences described in the book of the law would eventually come upon the nation. The years of rebellion under previous kings had already set certain events in motion. Josiah could not completely erase the past, yet he could reshape the present. And so the reforms continued with relentless momentum. One of the most striking aspects of Josiah's campaign was his willingness to confront traditions that had existed for generations. Some of the shrines he destroyed were ancient, older than the reigns of many kings. They had become woven into the cultural and religious habits of the people. Removing them required not only authority but courage, because every altar torn down represented a challenge to customs that many citizens had accepted as normal. But Josiah believed that restoring the covenant required more than symbolic gestures. The nation had to be rebuilt spiritually from its foundation. As the months passed and the reforms spread, the people of Judah began witnessing a transformation that few had expected when the temple repairs first began. What started as a construction project had evolved into a national movement of spiritual renewal. The rediscovery of the law had awakened the conscience of a king, and that awakening had triggered a wave of change powerful enough to reshape an entire kingdom. Yet even as the idols disappeared and the altars fell, the deeper challenge remained. Would the hearts of the people change as well? Removing statues and destroying shrines could alter the physical landscape of the land. But the covenant described in the book of the law demanded something far greater than outward reform. It required devotion, loyalty, and a commitment that reached into the daily lives of the people themselves. Josiah understood this. The reforms were not simply about removing false worship. They were about restoring a relationship that had been neglected for generations. The covenant was meant to guide justice, compassion, and faithfulness throughout the entire nation. And the king knew that if Judah truly wished to return to the path described in the ancient scroll, there was one event that needed to be restored above all others, an event that had once stood at the center of Israel's identity but had slowly faded from memory during the years of spiritual decline. It was the Passover. The celebration that remembered the deliverance of Israel from slavery had once united the nation in gratitude and reverence, yet over time the observance had become irregular and diminished, overshadowed by the rise of other traditions. Josiah decided that if the covenant was to be renewed completely, the Passover must return in its full significance. What followed would become one of the most remarkable religious celebrations recorded in the history of Judah, moment when the nation gathered to remember the story that had first defined them, and in doing so, rediscovered the identity they had nearly lost. The decision made by Josiah to restore the Passover was not simply another step in a series of religious reforms. It was something deeper, something symbolic enough to reach into the heart of the nation itself. For generations, the people of Judah had lived with fragments of their identity scattered across memory and tradition. The temple still stood, the priesthood still functioned, and certain rituals continued to be practiced. Yet the central story that once defined them had slowly faded into the background. Passover had always been more than a festival. It was the story of deliverance. Centuries earlier, when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, God had acted with unmistakable power to bring them out of bondage. Through the leadership of Moses, the people had walked away from oppression and begun their journey toward becoming a nation shaped by covenant rather than captivity. The Passover meal, celebrated each year, served as a reminder that their identity was rooted in that moment of rescue. Yet over time, the observance had become inconsistent. The influence of foreign worship had replaced the memory of that deliverance with rituals borrowed from neighboring cultures. Many people in Judah had grown up without fully understanding what Passover represented. They knew the name of the festival, but its meaning had been diluted by years of neglect and distraction. Josiah understood that restoring the covenant meant restoring the memory of that defining event. So he issued a command throughout the land that the Passover would once again be observed according to the instructions written in the rediscovered book of the law. Messengers traveled across cities and villages, announcing that the nation would gather in Jerusalem for a celebration unlike any that had taken place for generations. The announcement must have stirred curiosity and anticipation among the people. For some, it was the first time they had ever heard the festival described in its original form. For others, especially the older citizens who still remembered fragments of earlier traditions, the proclamation carried a sense of long-awaited restoration. Slowly, families began making preparations to travel to Jerusalem, bringing with them the animals required for sacrifice and the offerings that would accompany the celebration. As the appointed time approached, the city began to fill. Pilgrims arrived from every corner of Judah, along with people from territories that had once belonged to the northern kingdom of Israel. They came walking along dusty roads and narrow paths that wound through the hills, carrying their belongings and leading animals meant for the Passover meal. Jerusalem, which had often witnessed festivals in the past, now saw something extraordinary unfolding before its gates. This was not merely a tradition continuing as usual, it was a rediscovery. Within the temple courts, the priests prepared themselves for the massive gathering that would soon fill the sacred precincts. The high priest Hilkiah oversaw the organization of the rituals, ensuring that everything would be conducted according to the commands described in the law. Levites were assigned their responsibilities, musicians prepared their instruments, and officials coordinated the flow of worshippers who would arrive throughout the celebration. Josiah himself played a central role in making the event possible. The king provided animals for sacrifice in extraordinary numbers so that every family present could participate in the meal. His generosity ensured that even those who might have lacked resources would still be able to take part in the celebration. The scale of his contribution demonstrated not only his devotion but also his desire to unite the entire nation around the covenant being restored. When the Passover finally began, the temple courts overflowed with people. Smoke from sacrifices rose into the sky as priests carried out the rituals described in the ancient law. Families gathered together to share the meal that symbolized the night when their ancestors had prepared to leave Egypt in haste. Trusting the promise of freedom given by God, the atmosphere in Jerusalem must have been overwhelming, a mixture of solemn remembrance and renewed hope. The scriptures later record something remarkable about this event. It was said that a Passover like this had not been celebrated since the days of the judges who ruled Israel long before the monarchy was established. That statement reveals how deeply the festival had been neglected over the centuries. Generations of kings had come and gone without restoring the observance to its full meaning. But now, under the leadership of Josiah, the nation experienced a moment of unity and spiritual renewal that echoed the earliest days of its history. Throughout the city, the sound of voices filled the air as families retold the story of deliverance. Parents explained to their children why the meal was eaten in a specific way, why certain elements were included, and what the night represented. For many young listeners, it was the first time they truly understood the story that defined their people. In those moments, the covenant described in the rediscovered scroll was no longer just a text being read in the temple. It was becoming part of the living memory of the nation once again. Yet even in the midst of this powerful restoration, the prophecy delivered earlier by Huldah lingered quietly in the background. Her words had made it clear that the judgment described in the book of the law would not be completely avoided. The years of rebellion under previous kings had set consequences in motion that could not simply disappear. Josiah knew this. He understood that while the celebration of Passover marked a turning point for the nation, it did not erase the past entirely. The reforms he had initiated were acts of faithfulness in the present, even though the future still carried uncertainty. But that did not diminish the significance of what had just occurred. For a brief moment in the history of Judah, the people stood united in remembering who they were meant to be. The idols that had once dominated the land were gone. The temple had been purified. The covenant had been read publicly, and the story of deliverance had been celebrated once again. The nation had been given a glimpse of the identity it might have maintained if earlier generations had remained faithful. And at the center of this transformation stood the young king who had listened carefully when truth was spoken to him, truth first delivered, through the voice of a prophetess whose message had awakened his conscience and set this entire movement in motion. Yet history rarely remains still for long. Beyond the borders of Judah, the great empires of the ancient world were shifting and expanding. Their ambitions stretching across lands and kingdoms, political storms were gathering in the distance, forces that would soon intersect with the fragile renewal taking place within Jerusalem. The reforms of Josiah had changed the spiritual direction of the nation, but the world beyond Judah's hills was already moving toward events that would test the strength of that renewal in ways no one yet fully understood. The spiritual renewal that spread across Judah during the reign of Josiah created a moment unlike anything the nation had experienced in generations. The idols had been destroyed, the temple purified, and the covenant restored to public life through the rediscovered book of the law. For a time, the people of Judah lived within the influence of a king whose determination to honor God reshaped both their worship and their national identity. The Passover celebration had reminded them of their origins. of the night when their ancestors walked away from slavery under the leadership of Moses, and that memory had ignited a renewed sense of belonging to the covenant that had once defined them. Yet history rarely moves in straight lines. While spiritual reforms were transforming life within Judah, the world beyond its borders was undergoing its own dramatic shifts. The great empires that dominated the ancient Near East were constantly rising and falling, their ambitions stretching across territories and kingdoms in ways that smaller nations could not ignore. Judah, though strengthened internally by Josiah's reforms, still existed within this larger political landscape, and that landscape was beginning to change. For many years, the Assyrian Empire had been the dominant power in the region. Its armies feared across the lands surrounding Israel and Judah. It was Assyria that had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel decades earlier, scattering its people and reshaping the political map of the region. But by the time Josiah's reforms were reshaping Judah, Assyria's influence had begun to weaken. Internal struggles and external pressures were slowly eroding the empire's control. As Assyria declined, new powers began to compete for influence over the territories it once dominated. Among them was the rising kingdom of Babylon to the east, a force that would soon reshape the future of the entire region. At the same time, another ancient power, Egypt, sought to extend its influence northward once again. These movements created tension throughout the lands between them, turning smaller kingdoms like Judah into strategic locations within a much larger conflict. Josiah could not ignore these developments. Though his heart was focused on spiritual restoration, he was still a king responsible for protecting his nation. The roads that passed through Judah connected powerful empires, and the decisions made by foreign rulers could easily affect the security of Jerusalem. What happened beyond Judah's borders would eventually reach the gates of the city itself. It was during this period of shifting power that an event occurred which would alter the course of Josiah's reign in a way few could have predicted. The Egyptian ruler Necho II began moving his army northward through the region. His goal was not originally directed toward Judah but toward assisting the remaining Assyrian forces against the growing strength of Babylon. To reach the battlefield, however, his army needed to pass through territory that lay close to Judah's borders. When Josiah learned of the approaching Egyptian forces, he made a decision that has puzzled historians and readers of the biblical narrative for centuries. Rather than allowing the army to pass without interference, Josiah chose to confront it. The reasons behind this decision remained the subject of much reflection. Some believe Josiah feared that Egypt's expanding influence would threaten Judah's independence. Others suggest that the king may have believed he was acting in defense of the region's stability or fulfilling a political alliance that is no longer fully documented. Whatever his reasoning, the choice placed him directly in the path of one of the most powerful armies in the ancient world. The confrontation took place in the region of Megiddo, a strategic location that had witnessed many battles throughout history. There on the plains that stretched beneath the hills, Josiah's forces met the advancing army of Pharaoh Necho according to the ancient accounts. The Egyptian ruler sent a message to Josiah before the battle began. Necho claimed that his campaign was not directed against Judah and warned the king not to interfere with his mission. He even suggested that God had instructed him to move quickly toward his objective, but Josiah did not withdraw. The king who had transformed the spiritual life of his nation now found himself standing in a moment of military confrontation that would determine his own fate. Disguising himself before the battle began, he entered the conflict alongside his soldiers, perhaps hoping to avoid becoming a visible target. Yet the battle did not unfold in Judah's favor. During the fighting, Josiah was struck by an arrow. The wound he received proved fatal, and his attendants quickly carried him away from the battlefield. They placed him in a chariot and transported him back toward Jerusalem, the city he had spent his reign striving to restore. When the news spread through the land that Josiah had been killed, grief swept across the nation. The king who had rediscovered the law, destroyed the idols and restored the Passover had fallen unexpectedly in battle. His death marked the end of one of the most remarkable periods of reform in the history of Judah. The people who had witnessed his determination to return the nation to the covenant now faced the uncertain future that followed his sudden absence. In Jerusalem, mourning filled the city. The loss of Josiah was not simply the death of a ruler. For many, it felt like the loss of a guiding voice that had reminded the nation who it was meant to be. The reforms he had initiated had changed the landscape of Judah, but the long-term strength of those changes would now depend on the leaders who followed him. Among those who grieved was the prophet Jeremiah, who composed laments to honor the fallen king. His sorrow reflected the deep respect many felt for Josiah's devotion to restoring the covenant. The king had pursued righteousness with sincerity, even though the prophecy delivered earlier by Huldah had already hinted that the future of Judah would still carry consequences from the sins of earlier generations. Huldah's words had promised that Josiah himself would not witness the destruction that would eventually come upon the nation. In a tragic sense, that promise had been fulfilled. The king who humbled himself before the rediscovered law had been gathered to his ancestors before the disasters described in the covenant would fully unfold. His life ended before Judah would face the storms that were beginning to form across the political and spiritual horizon. But the question that remained was unsettling. Would the nation continue walking in the path Josiah had restored, or would the momentum of reform fade once the king who led it was gone? The answer to that question would determine whether the transformation sparked by a forgotten scroll and confirmed by the voice of its prophetess would endure, whether the people of Judah would once again drift back toward the patterns that had nearly destroyed them before. The death of Josiah left a silence over Judah that no celebration, reform, or memory could easily fill. For years the nation had moved under the momentum of his leadership, watching idols fall, hearing the rediscovered covenant read aloud, and participating in the renewal that had reshaped their spiritual identity. The king's devotion had not only changed laws and religious practices, it had given the people a sense that their nation could still return to the path laid down centuries earlier through Moses. Now that guiding presence was suddenly gone. When the wounded king was brought back from the battlefield of Megiddo and the news of his death spread through Jerusalem, grief moved quickly through the city like a gathering storm. The people who filled the streets and courtyards did not mourn merely because a ruler had died. They mourned because they understood what his reign had represented. Josiah had been the rare kind of leader who listened when confronted with truth. When the rediscovered book of the law revealed how far the nation had wandered from the covenant, he did not ignore the warning. Instead, he allowed the message spoken by Huldah to reshape the direction of the entire kingdom. That moment of humility had triggered a transformation that few believed possible. Temples polluted by years of idolatry had been cleansed. Altars dedicated to foreign gods had been destroyed. The Passover, forgotten by generations, had been restored with a celebration so powerful that the scriptures later said nothing like it had been seen since ancient times. For a brief period in Judah's history, the people had rediscovered who they were meant to be. And now the king who had led that awakening lay dead. In Jerusalem the mourning became public and profound. The loss of Josiah reached beyond politics or royal succession. It touched the spiritual hopes that had begun to grow within the nation. Many people feared that the reforms he had established might not survive the shifting tides of leadership that inevitably followed a king's death. Among those who expressed grief most deeply was the prophet Jeremiah. His voice had long warned Judah about the consequences of turning away from the covenant, and he understood better than most how rare Josiah's devotion had been. When the king died, Jeremiah composed laments that were remembered for generations. These songs of mourning captured the sorrow felt by a people who realized they had lost a ruler whose heart had genuinely sought righteousness. Yet history rarely pauses long enough for grief to fully settle. Political realities soon began to reshape the future of Judah. After Josiah's death, the people placed his son on the throne, hoping that the legacy of reform would continue under the next generation. But the situation surrounding the kingdom had grown increasingly unstable. The movements of powerful empires across the region meant that the fate of Judah could not be determined by internal leadership alone. Egypt, whose army had defeated Josiah at Megiddo, still maintained influence over the region. The pharaoh who had marched northward now held significant power over the smaller kingdoms caught between Egypt and the rising strength of Babylon. Judah, weakened by the loss of its reforming king, found itself vulnerable to those forces. Within months, the fragile balance of power began to shift again. The Egyptian ruler Necho II intervened directly in the leadership of Judah, removing Josiah's chosen successor and installing another ruler in his place. This act signaled that the kingdom no longer controlled its own destiny with the independence it once enjoyed. Foreign empires now influenced who would sit on the throne of David. As the years passed, the spiritual reforms initiated by Josiah began to weaken. Without the king's relentless determination, many of the practices he had worked so hard to eliminate slowly returned. Some leaders lacked his courage, others lacked his devotion, and still others were drawn back toward alliances and cultural influences that once again blurred the nation's loyalty to the covenant. The idols that had been destroyed did not immediately reappear, but the attitudes that had allowed idolatry to flourish began resurfacing among the people. This gradual erosion revealed a painful truth. While Josiah's reforms had changed the visible structure of the nation's worship, the deeper transformation of the people's hearts had not fully taken root. Many had followed the king's commands while he lived, yet their devotion did not always continue once his authority was gone. Throughout this unfolding decline, the earlier prophecy delivered by Huldah remained hauntingly relevant. When she spoke to the delegation sent by Josiah years earlier, she had confirmed that the judgment described in the book of the law would eventually come upon Judah because of the sins accumulated over generations. The king's humility had delayed that disaster, ensuring that he would not witness it during his lifetime. Now that promise had taken on new meaning. Josiah had indeed been gathered to his ancestors before the full consequences of Judah's rebellion arrived. The king who rediscovered the covenant had been spared from watching the nation face the devastation that would eventually unfold. But the warning itself had not disappeared. Beyond the borders of Judah, the rising power of Babylon continued to reshape the political world of the ancient Near East. Empires were colliding, alliances shifting, and armies moving across territories that once seemed distant from Jerusalem's quiet hills. Those movements were gradually drawing closer, and when they finally reached the gates of Judah, the nation would face trials unlike anything it had known before. Yet even as those dark clouds gathered on the horizon, the memory of Josiah's reforms remained an important chapter in the story of Israel's faith. His reign demonstrated something extraordinary, that a single moment of humility before truth could ignite a movement capable of transforming an entire nation. The discovery of a forgotten scroll had awakened a king's conscience, and that awakening had reshaped the spiritual life of Judah in ways that echoed long after his death. And standing quietly at the beginning of that transformation was the voice of a prophetess who had spoken without fear when the king sought guidance. Though her name appears only briefly in the ancient record, the message delivered by Huldah had changed the course of history. Her words had confirmed the seriousness of the covenant, awakened the heart of a king, and set in motion reforms that would be remembered for generations. Sometimes history celebrates the rulers who issue commands and lead armies. But behind many of those turning points stands a quieter voice, one willing to speak truth clearly at the moment when a nation most needs to hear it. The years that followed the death of Josiah felt strangely different from the powerful renewal that had defined his reign. During Josiah's lifetime, the nation of Judah had experienced a dramatic return to the covenant, a moment when forgotten truths had been rediscovered and acted upon with urgency. Idols had been shattered, sacred spaces purified, and the ancient law brought back into the center of national life. But history has a way of revealing whether a transformation is truly rooted in the hearts of people or simply anchored in the leadership of one extraordinary individual. Without Josiah guiding the nation, the momentum of reform began to weaken. The people who had once gathered in Jerusalem to celebrate the restored Passover gradually returned to the rhythms of ordinary life. Some remained faithful to the covenant, remembering the reforms that had swept through the land. Others, however, slowly drifted back toward the influences that had shaped the kingdom before Josiah's awakening. Cultural pressures, political alliances, and personal ambitions began to blur the clarity that the rediscovered book of the law had once brought to the nation. The kings who followed Josiah struggled to maintain the spiritual direction he had established. Leadership changed quickly, and the fragile stability of Judah became increasingly tied to the movements of powerful empires surrounding it. Egypt, whose army had clashed with Josiah at Megiddo under Necho II, continued to exert influence across the region. Yet even as Egypt sought to maintain control, another empire was rising with astonishing speed in the east. Babylon was expanding. Its armies moved steadily across territories that once belonged to the declining Assyrian Empire, absorbing cities and kingdoms into a growing domain. For smaller nations like Judah, these shifts created a dangerous reality. Their independence depended not only on their own strength but also on the unpredictable ambitions of the great power surrounding them. As Babylon's influence grew, the political pressure on Judah intensified. Leaders within Jerusalem faced difficult choices about alliances, loyalty, and survival. Some believed cooperation with foreign powers might preserve the kingdom's stability, while others feared that such compromises would erode the nation's identity even further. These tensions created divisions within the leadership of the land, and the spiritual clarity that had once defined Josiah's reforms slowly began to fade. Throughout these uncertain years, the words spoken earlier by Huldah remained a quiet but persistent reminder of what lay ahead. When the delegation from Josiah first visited her home in Jerusalem, she had delivered a message that contained both hope and warning. The king's humility had delayed the disaster described in the book of the law, but the accumulated rebellion of earlier generations still carried consequences. Now those consequences were beginning to move closer. Within the city, voices like that of Jeremiah continued to call the people back to faithfulness. Jeremiah spoke with urgency, warning that Judah could not rely on the temple or its traditions alone to guarantee safety. True security, he insisted, depended on justice, humility, and obedience to the covenant. Yet his warnings often met resistance. Many leaders preferred messages of reassurance rather than confronting the uncomfortable truths he proclaimed. This growing tension between prophetic warning and political ambition created a fragile atmosphere within Jerusalem. While some citizens remembered the reforms of Josiah and longed to continue that path, others believed the nation could survive by adapting to the pressures of the surrounding world. The spiritual unity that once filled the temple courts during the great Passover celebration slowly dissolved into competing visions of the kingdom's future. Meanwhile, Babylon's expansion continued. Its armies moved steadily through the region, defeating rivals and absorbing territories that once stood independently. Cities that had existed for centuries suddenly found themselves under the authority of a new empire. Each victory brought Babylon closer to the borders of Judah. The people of Jerusalem could sense that something significant was approaching. Trade routes carried stories of distant battles. Travelers spoke about armies larger than anything seen in generations. Diplomats arrived with warnings, demands, and shifting alliances. The world beyond Judah's hills was changing rapidly, and those changes were drawing the kingdom into a larger conflict it could not avoid forever. For those who remembered the message delivered by Huldah years earlier, these developments must have carried a haunting familiarity. Her prophecy had confirmed that the judgment written in the rediscovered law would eventually reach Judah. The nation had been given a moment of renewal through Josiah's leadership. But that renewal had not erased the deeper pattern of rebellion that had shaped earlier generations. The approaching political storms now seemed to mirror the spiritual warnings recorded in the covenant. And yet, even in the midst of this growing uncertainty, the memory of what had happened during Josiah's reign remained powerful. The people had once witnessed a remarkable transformation sparked by the rediscovery of a forgotten scroll. They had seen a king humble himself before truth and lead an entire nation toward repentance. That moment proved something important. It showed that history does not move only through empires and armies. Sometimes the direction of a nation can change because one person listens when truth is spoken. Josiah had listened when the message of God reached him through the voice of Huldah. His response had ignited reforms that reshaped the spiritual landscape of Judah. Now the future of the nation would reveal whether those reforms had planted seeds strong enough to survive the storms gathering beyond the horizon. Because the forces approaching Jerusalem were not merely political rivals or distant armies. They were the beginning of events that would test the covenant itself and determine whether the lessons learned during Josiah's extraordinary reign would be remembered or forgotten when the greatest trials finally arrived.
The final years of Judah's independence unfolded beneath a shadow that had been quietly approaching for decades. Long before armies surrounded Jerusalem, long before the city's walls faced siege and destruction, the warnings had already been spoken. They had been written in the rediscovered book of the law, read aloud before the people during the reign of Josiah, and confirmed by the prophetic voice of Huldah. Her message had been clear. The consequences of generations of rebellion would eventually reach the nation of Judah. The king's humility had delayed that moment, but it could not erase the past entirely. After Josiah's death, the fragile renewal he had led slowly began to unravel. Leadership changed quickly, and the spiritual clarity that once defined the kingdom faded into uncertainty. Some rulers attempted to maintain aspects of the covenant Josiah had restored, but others drifted toward alliances and practices that reopened the door to the very influences the reforms had once destroyed. Meanwhile, the political world beyond Judah continued to shift with relentless force. The empire of Babylon rose rapidly, extending its power across territories that once belonged to Assyria, and challenging the influence of Egypt throughout the region. Cities fell under its authority one by one, and kingdoms that had existed for centuries suddenly found themselves under the control of a new and formidable ruler. Eventually, the attention of this growing empire turned toward the small kingdom that sat along the trade routes between larger powers. Judah. In Jerusalem, voices like that of Jeremiah warned that the nation could not rely on political strategies alone to survive the approaching crisis. Jeremiah reminded the people repeatedly that their true security depended on faithfulness to the covenant rather than alliances with foreign empires. Yet many leaders found those warnings difficult to accept. In moments of political pressure, it was easier to trust military plans or diplomatic agreements than to confront the deeper spiritual issues that prophets continued to raise. Eventually, the inevitable confrontation arrived. The armies of Babylon, led by the powerful king Nebuchadnezzar II, marched westward and asserted their authority across the region. Jerusalem, with its strategic location and political history, could not escape their attention. The city that had once celebrated the rediscovery of the covenant now faced the reality of imperial power pressing against its borders. The first encounters between Judah and Babylon did not immediately destroy the kingdom. Instead, they introduced a period of tension in which the nation became a vassal state, forced to acknowledge Babylonian authority. Tribute was demanded, and members of the royal court were taken away into exile. Among those carried to Babylon in the early stages of this conflict was a young man who would later become known for his faithfulness in a foreign land, Daniel. But the deeper crisis had only begun. Over time, resistance against Babylon grew within Jerusalem. Political leaders hoped they might reclaim independence, perhaps through alliances with Egypt or other neighboring powers. These ambitions led to rebellion against Babylonian control, a decision that ultimately triggered the devastating response the prophets had long warned about. Babylon returned with overwhelming force. The armies surrounding Jerusalem built siege works around the city, cutting off supplies and slowly tightening their grip on its defenses. Hunger spread among the population, and the once bustling streets of the capital grew quiet under the strain of the prolonged siege. Inside the walls, fear and desperation replaced the confidence that had once accompanied Josiah's reforms. Eventually, the city fell. The Babylonian forces broke through the defenses, and Jerusalem, long considered the spiritual and political heart of Judah, was conquered. The temple that had been cleansed during Josiah's reforms, the very place where the rediscovered book of the law had been read aloud before the nation, was destroyed. Flames consumed the sacred structure, and the treasures that once filled its courts were carried away to Babylon. Many of the people were taken into exile. Families were separated from their homeland, forced to live in a foreign land under the authority of a distant empire. The kingdom of Judah, which had endured through centuries of conflict and change, now stood in ruins. What remained of the nation existed not as an independent kingdom, but as a scattered community, far from the land that had once defined their identity. For those who remembered the message spoken decades earlier by Huldah, the tragedy unfolding around them must have carried a painful sense of recognition. The prophecy delivered during Josiah's reign had warned that the consequences of the nation's rebellion would eventually arrive. Though Josiah himself had been spared from witnessing this destruction, the words spoken through the prophetess had proven true. And yet, even within this devastating chapter of history, the story did not end in complete despair. The same covenant that warned of judgment also spoke of restoration. The God who disciplined the nation for its unfaithfulness had not abandoned his people forever. Prophets continued to speak about a future in which exile would end, and the scattered community of Israel would one day return to rebuild what had been lost. In that sense, the message of Huldah carried more than a warning. It revealed the seriousness of the covenant that bound the people to their God. Her voice had awakened a king, sparked a national reform, and reminded an entire generation that faithfulness still mattered, even when the past could not be undone. Today, when readers encounter her brief appearance in the biblical narrative, it may seem like a small moment in a much larger story. Her name appears only a handful of times, and yet the impact of her message shaped the destiny of a nation. She spoke truth when a king sought guidance. She confirmed the authority of the rediscovered law. And through her words, a forgotten covenant once again stood before the people of Judah with undeniable clarity. History often remembers kings, battles, and empires. But sometimes the turning point of a nation begins with a quiet voice willing to speak the truth of God without fear, without compromise, and without concern for recognition. That was the legacy of Huldah, the forgotten prophetess whose message altered the destiny of Israel.